Another example is given to illustrate the point. A monk asked Joshu of the Tang dynasty. It is stated that the perfect way knows no difficulties, only that it abhors discrimination. What is meant by no discrimination? Joshu said, "Above the heavens and below the heavens, I alone am the honored one." The monk suggested, "Still a discrimination." The master's retort was, "Oh, this worthless fellow, where is the discrimination?" By discrimination, the Zen masters mean what we have when we refuse to accept reality as it is or in its suchness, for we then reflect on it and analyze it into concepts, going on with intellection and finally landing on a circulatory reasoning. Joshu's affirmation is a final one and allows no equivocation, no argumentation. We have simply to take it as it stands and remain satisfied with it. In case we somehow fail to do this, we just leave it alone and go somewhere else to seek our own enlightenment. The monk could not see where Joshu was, and he went further on and remarked, "This is still a discrimination." The discrimination in point of fact is on the monk's side and not on Joshu's. Hence the honored one now turns into a worthless fellow. As I said before, the phrase all in one and one in all is not to be analyzed first to the concepts one and all, and the preposition is not then to be put between them. No discrimination is to be exercised here, but one is just to accept it and abide with it, which is really no abiding at all. There is nothing further to do, hence the master's striking or calling names. He is not indignant, nor is he short-tempered, but he wishes thereby to help his disciples out of the pit which they have dug for themselves. No amount of argument avails here, no verbal persuasion. Only the master knows how to turn them away from a logical impasse and how to open a new way for them. Let them therefore simply follow him. By following him, they all come back to their original home. When an intuitive or experiential understanding of reality is verbally formulated as all in one and one in all, we have there the fundamental statement as it is taught by all the various schools of Buddhism. In the terminology of the Prajna school, this is shunyata or emptiness, is tathata or suchness, and tathata is shunyata. Shunyata is the world of the absolute, and tathata is the world of particulars. One of the commonest sayings in Zen is, "Willows are green and flowers red," or "Bamboos are straight and pine trees are gnarled." Facts of experience are accepted as they are. Zen is not nihilistic, nor is it merely positivistic. Zen would say that just because the bamboo is straight, it is of emptiness, or that just because of emptiness, the bamboo cannot be anything else but a bamboo, and not a pine tree. What makes the Zen statements different from mere sense experience, however, is that Zen's intuition grows out of transcendental wisdom, or prajna, and not out of relative knowledge, or vijna. It is from this point of view that when asked, "What is Zen?" the master sometimes answers, "Zen," and sometimes not Zen. We can see now that the principle of sumie painting is derived from this Zen experience, and that directness, simplicity, movement, spirituality, completeness, and other qualities we observe in the sumie class of oriental paintings have organic relationship to Zen. There is no pantheism in sumie, as there is none in Zen. There is another thing I must not forget to mention in this connection, which is perhaps the most important factor in sumie as well as in Zen. It is creativity. When it is said that sumie depicts the spirit of an object, or that it gives a form to what has no form, this means that there must be a spirit of creativity moving over the picture. The painter's business thus is not just to copy or imitate nature, but to give to the object something living in its own right. It is the same with the Zen master. When he says that the willow is green and the flower is red, he is not just giving us a description of how nature looks, but something whereby green is green and red is red. This something is what I call the spirit of creativity. Shunyata is formless, but it is the fountainhead of all possibilities. To turn what is possible into an actuality is an act of creativity. When Tosu is asked, "What is Dharma?" he answers, "Dharma." When asked, "What is Buddha?" he answers, "Buddha." This is by no means a parrot-like response, a mere echoing. All the answers come out of his creative mind, without which there is no Zen in Tosu. The understanding of Zen is to understand what kind of mind this is. Yaku-san's meeting with Riko will illustrate this. Yaku-san, who lived from 751 to 834, was a great master of the Tang era. When Riko, governor of the province, heard of his Zen mastership, he sent for him to come to the capital. Yaku-san, however, refused to come. This happened several times. Riko grew impatient and came in person to see the master in his own mountain retreat. Yaku-san was reading the sutras and paid no attention whatever to the arrival of the governor. The attendant monk reminded the master of the fact, but he still kept on reading. Riko felt hurt and remarked, "Seeing the face is not at all like hearing the name." By this he meant that the person in actuality was not equal to his reputation. Yaku-san called out, "Oh, governor!" Riko echoed at once, "Yes, master." The master then said, "Why do you evaluate the hearing over the seeing?" The governor apologized and asked, "What is Tao?" Yaku-san pointed up with his hand and then down and said, "Do you understand?" Riko said, "No, master." Thereupon Yaku-san remarked, "The clouds are in the sky and water in the jar." It is said that this pleased the governor very much. Did Riko really understand what Yaku-san meant? Yaku-san's is no more than a plain statement of the facts as they are, and we may ask, where is Tao? Riko was a great scholar and philosopher. He must have had some abstract conception of Tao. Could he so readily reconcile his view with Yaku-san's? Whatever we may say about this, Yaku-san and Tosu and other Zen masters are all walking the same track. The artists are also required to strike it. Now let us turn to Zen and the study of Confucianism. Paradoxical and ironical though it may seem, Zen, whose teaching is against all learning, all literary reconstruction, was the agency in Japan for encouraging the study of Confucianism, and furthermore, for promoting the art of printing, not only of Buddhist books, but also of Confucian and Shinto literature. The Kamakura period, which extended from 1185 to 1338, and the Ashikaga period from 1338 to 1568, are generally considered the dark ages of Japanese history. The fact is, they are very much otherwise. During those times, the Zen monks were active in bringing Chinese culture into Japan and preparing the way for its assimilation later on. Indeed, what we now regard as particularly Japanese was in the process of hatching during those periods. In them, we may trace the beginnings of haiku, no-gaku, theater, landscape gardening, flower arrangement, and the art of tea. Here I wish to confine myself to the development of Confucian study in Japan, as it was influenced by the Zen monks. To do this, it is advisable to say a word about the Song philosophy in China. Politically, the Song was a troubled age in the history of China. The Middle Kingdom was constantly menaced from the north, so that it had to retreat southward, crossing the Huai, and finally, in 1126, to submit to the domination of the northern barbarian tribes. This marks the end of the northern Song, from 960 to 1126. The southern Song started in 1127, when the Emperor Kaozong was enthroned at Linan south of the Yangtze River. This lasted until 1279, when the Mongol invaders succeeded in completely overturning the steadily declining dynasty, which had first been established by the Chao family more than 300 years before. In spite of the succession of these politically eventful days, the Song, both northern and especially southern, left brilliant records in the world of thought and general culture. There were poets, artists, Confucian philosophers, and Buddhist thinkers, including Zen masters. Philosophy achieved a phenomenal development in the South. It seemed as if the original speculative impulses pent up during the Han and succeeding dynasties and more or less suppressed by the powerful thought of India burst out and asserted itself in this period, even under the pressure of an alien power. The result was the rise of a philosophy we may properly call Chinese, in which all the trends of thought imported from abroad, as well as those primarily native to China, were syncretized and formulated on the basis of the Chinese mentality, and therefore made more readily acceptable to it. The Sung philosophy is the flower of the Chinese mind. One powerful factor, at least, that helped to give such a fruitful stimulus to Chinese speculation was the teaching of Zen. Zen is always stimulating and thought-provoking because it goes directly to the root of things, regardless of superstructures. When Confucianism turned into the mere study of ritual and the practice of earthly morals, all scarcely more than textual criticism by schools of commentators, we can say that it was on the verge of collapse and final death as a source of creative speculation. It required a new force to resuscitate it. Taoism, the rival school of Chinese thought, was deeply buried under its own more popular and superstitious framework. There was in it nothing of intellectual vigor that would instill fresh blood into Confucianism. If Zen had failed to stir the depths of Chinese psychology during the Tang, the people of the Sung would probably never have newly taken up their own philosophy and pursued its reconstruction and further unfolding. Almost all the thinkers of the Sung, at least once in their lives, betook themselves to the Zen monasteries. With whatever insight or no insight they carried out of these institutions, they re-examined their own philosophy, born of their own soil. The Sung philosophy is the outcome of their spiritual adventures. While denouncing Buddhism and the Buddhist way of thinking, they drank deeply from the Indian fountain presented to them in Zen. The Zen monks, on the other hand, were students of Confucianism as well. As Chinese, they could be nothing else. The difference between Confucian scholars and Zen masters was that the Confucians based their philosophy on the native system, while the Zen Buddhists adhered to their own, although they adopted the Confucian vocabulary. Indeed, they quite frequently expressed themselves in terms of Confucianism. It may be said that the difference between the two classes of mind lay in the placing of emphasis. The Zen monks interpreted the Confucian texts in the Indian fashion, so to speak, that is, more or less idealistically, and they were not averse to commenting on Buddhist literature from the Confucian point of view. When these monks came to Japan, they brought both Zen and Confucianism. The Japanese monks who went over to China to study Zen brought back the same. That is, together with their own Zen books, they filled their traveling cases with books on Confucianism and Taoism. While in China, they sat at the feet of the Zen Confucian masters and learned much of both disciplines. And there were many such Chinese masters in the Sung areas, especially in the southern Sung. I will not enter into too much detail in regard to the interrelationship of Zen with Confucianism and Taoism in China. Suffice it to state here that Zen is, in fact, the Chinese way of responding to Indian thought as represented by Buddhism, and that this being so, Zen as it developed in the Tang and later flourished in the Sung could be nothing else but a reflection of Chinese mentality. By this I mean it was eminently practical and ethical. In this respect, there was every probability of Zen's taking on Confucian coloring. But in the beginning of Zen's history, its philosophy was Indian, that is, Buddhistic, for there was nothing corresponding to it in the traditional teaching of Confucianism. And this was the element the later Confucian thinkers consciously or unconsciously wished to incorporate into their own system. In other words, Zen acquired its practicalness from Confucianism, whereas Confucianism absorbed through the teaching of Zen, though in some respects, indirectly, the Indian habit of abstract speculation, and finally succeeded in giving a metaphysical foundation to the teaching of Confucius and his followers. To do this, the Song philosophers emphasized the utmost importance of the 4 books in the study of Confucianism. The 4 books are Daigaku, Great Learning, Chuyo, Doctrine of the Mean, Rongo, Confucian Analects, and Moshi, the Works of Mencius. The Great Learning and the Doctrine of the Mean are ascribed to Zhuzi, grandson of Confucius. They contain the gist of Confucian teaching and were taken up as such for the first time by the Song scholars, one of whom was Zhuzi, who wrote commentaries on them in the 12th century. Confucius's Analects, compiled by his disciples after his death, record the master's sayings, conduct, talks with his disciples, etc. Mencius, one of the most prominent early advocates of Confucianism, who lived in the 3rd century BC, was an eloquent and astute thinker of his day. The Song philosophers found in these books some statements which could be elaborated for the establishment of their system. This naturally paved the way for a rapprochement between Zen and Confucianism. Zen Buddhists are sometimes Confucianists, sometimes Taoists, or sometimes even Shintoists. Zen experience can also be explained by Western philosophy. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the 5 mountains, that is, the 5 Zen monasteries in Kyoto, were the publishing headquarters of the Confucian texts, to say nothing about the Zen books. Some of these earlier texts, including those of the 13th century, both Buddhist and Confucian, are still obtainable and among the most highly prized woodcut prints in the Far East. Not only did the Zen monks edit and print the textbooks of Buddhism and Confucianism, but they compiled books for popular education. These they used in their monasteries, where people crowded who were desirous of improving their knowledge and culture. The term Terracoya thus came into vogue. Terra means Buddhist temple, Ko, children, and Ya, house. The Terracoya system was the only institution of popular education during the feudal ages of Japan, until it was replaced by the modern system after the Restoration in 1868. The activities of the Zen monks were not confined to the central parts of Japan. They were invited by the provincial lords to look after the education of their vassals and retainers. They were Buddhist Confucianists. As one of the most notable examples, we mention a Zen monk of the 15th century, Keiyan, who went to Satsuma, the southwestern province in Kyushu. His special study was the 4 books, which he explained according to the commentaries of Shushi. But being a Zen monk, he did not forget to emphasize his own teaching in connection with the Confucian philosophy. The study of mind was the guiding spirit of his discipline. He also lectured on the Shurqing, one of the 5 canons, which contains the ethical edicts of the ancient rulers of China. The 5 canons are Yekikyo, or the I Ching, the Book of Changes, Shikyo, the Book of Odes, Shokyo, the Book of Annals, Shunju, Spring and Autumn, and Reiki, the Record of Rites. The Book of Changes is a very strange and enigmatic book. It may be regarded as containing the old Chinese way of thinking based on the dualistic principles of yin, female, and yang, male. It also contains 10 expository essays ascribed to Confucius. The Book of Odes is a collection of popular songs, as well as hymns on the state occasions prevailing from about the 15th century BC down to the 3rd century BC. The Book of Annals is a kind of political history beginning with the era of Yao, legendarily reigning from 2357 to 2255 BC, down to the Chu dynasty, which ended in 255 BC. The Spring and Autumn is another political history, first compiled by the historians of the state of Lu and revised by Confucius and completed in 478 BC. The Record of Rites contains rites in practice from toward the end of the Chu dynasty down to 140 BC. The record in current circulation has 47 sections, comprising the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, and others. Keiyan left in Satsuma an enduring spiritual influence. Among his distant disciples, the name of Shimadzu Nishinsai stands out most prominently. Although he was not taught by Keiyan himself, his mother and his teachers were personally acquainted with Keiyan, and all their families were great admirers of the monk scholar. Nishinsai was born of the Shimadzu family, and his eldest son was later adopted by the main family and came to rule the 3 provinces of Satsuma, Osumi, and Hyuga in the southwestern part of Japan. Nishinsai's moral influence spread, through his son, all over the feudal estate under his jurisdiction. Until the restoration of 1868, he was rightly honored by the people as one of the greatest figures among them. Of the Zen masters of the 5 mountains, mention may be made of Muso, the national teacher, Genye, Kokwan Shiren, Chuganyangetsu, Gido Shushin, and others from the 13th and 14th centuries, all of whom furthered the study of the Confucian classics in accordance with the spirit of Zen Buddhism. The emperors and the shoguns also followed the example of the Zen masters. They were earnest students of Zen and at the same time attended their lectures on Confucianism. The Emperor Hanazono, who reigned from 1308 to 1317, was a sincere scholar of the Song school of Chinese philosophy and an earnest follower of Zen, in which he went far beyond dilettantism. The admonition he left for his successor is a remarkable document of royal wisdom. His statue, in the attire of a Zen monk sitting cross-legged in serene dignity, is still preserved in his own room at Myoshinji, where he used to sit in meditation. His journal is important historical source material, and his residence, which was given to his Zen teacher, Kwanzan, became the foundation of the present Myoshinji, the most powerful branch of Rinzai Zen in the western part of Kyoto. I may add here that even in the early days of the Tokugawa shogunate, that is, at the beginning of the 17th century, the Confucian scholars used to shave their heads like Buddhist priests. From this fact we gather that the study of Confucianism was kept up among the Buddhists, especially the Zen monks, and even when the study came to be pursued independently among the intellectuals, its professors simply followed the old custom. In connection with this essay, the writer wishes to add a few remarks about the part played by Zen in the cultivation of the nationalistic spirit during the Kamakura and the Ashikaga periods. Theoretically speaking, Zen has nothing to do with nationalism. As long as it is a religion, its mission has universal validity, and its field of applicability is not limited to any one nationality. But from the point of view of history, it is subject to accidents and particularization. When Zen first came to Japan, it became identified with persons steeped in Confucianism and patriotic spirit, and Zen naturally took their color unto itself. That is to say, Zen was not received in Japan in its pure form, free of the effect of all accidents of place and time. Not only that, the Japanese followers themselves were willing to take Zen with everything that came along with it, until later the accidentals were separated from the body to which they were attached, and came to establish themselves independently, even in defiance of their original association. A description of this process in the history of Japanese thought does not belong here, but I do wish to refer to it more or less tentatively in tracing it back to the Chinese thought movement. As I said elsewhere, the culmination of Chinese intellectuality is found in the philosophy of the 12th century Chütze, who flourished mainly in the southern Song. He was probably the greatest among Chinese thinkers who tried to systematize Chinese thought along the lines of the psychology of the people. There were greater philosophers before him among his countrymen, but their thought moved along the Indian line of speculation, somewhat against their native trends. For this reason, their philosophy did not influence the people so directly as did that of the Southern Song. It is no doubt true that the Southern Song school could not have had its existence without its Buddhist predecessors. We must now see how the so-called science of the Tao developed in Song, for this will help us to understand Zen's specific influence on the thought and feeling of the Japanese people. There are two original currents in Chinese thought, Confucianism and pure Taoism, that is, the Taoism not colored by popular beliefs and superstitions. Confucianism represents the practicality or positivism of Chinese mentality, whereas Taoism represents its mystic and speculative trends. When Buddhism was brought to China in the early latter Han dynasty in 64 AD, it found a real associate in the thought of Lao Tzu and Chuanzi. In the beginning, Buddhism was not much active in Chinese thought. Its adherents occupied themselves mostly with translating its texts into Chinese, and the people did not know exactly how to take it into their system of thoughts and beliefs. But through the translations, they must have realized that there was something very deep, very inspiring in the philosophy of Buddhism. Since the 2nd century, when the Prajnaparamita Sutras were first rendered into Chinese, thinkers were deeply impressed by them and took up their study in all seriousness. While they could not clearly grasp the idea of shunyata or emptiness, they found it somewhat akin to the Taoist idea of wu, nothingness. During the 6 dynasties, from 386 to 587, when the study of Taoism carried the day to the extent that the Confucian texts themselves were interpreted in the light of Taoism, Kumarajiva came from a Western kingdom to China in 401 and translated a number of the Mahayana Sutras. He was not only a brilliant translator, but a great original thinker who shed much light on the understanding of the Mahayana, and his Chinese disciples busied themselves in developing his ideas in the way most adapted to the mentality of their people. The Sanlun, Sanron in Japanese, school of Buddhism thus came to be established in China in the 6th century by Chizang, who based his philosophy on the teachings of Nagarjuna. It was a wonderful system of thought, rising for the first time in the land of Confucius and Lao Tzu. But we can say that the author of the school was still under the influence of Indian thought. He thought as Indians did, and not necessarily in the Chinese fashion. He was no doubt a Chinese Buddhist, but a Buddhist scholar. If this were possible, he thought as a Buddhist and not as a Chinese. The Sanlun school was followed by the Tiantai, Wei Shi, and the Huayan in the Sui and the Tang dynasties. The Tiantai is based on the Sadharma Pundarika, the Wei Shi on the idealistic teachings of Asanga and Vasubandhu, and the Huayan on the philosophy of the infinite as expounded in the Avatamsaka. The last was the culmination of Chinese Buddhist thought. It demonstrates the height of religious speculation reached by Chinese Buddhist minds. It is the most remarkable thought system ever elaborated by people of the East. The Avatamsaka Sutra, including the Dasabhumika and the Gandhavuya, is no doubt the climax of Indian creative imagination, which is utterly foreign to Chinese thinking and feeling. And it is really an intellectual feat of the Chinese Buddhists that this so completely strange imagination of the Indians could be intelligently and systematically digested. The philosophy of the Huayan school proves the depth of the Chinese religious consciousness, which revealed itself after centuries of Buddhist education and reflection. And this was really what stirred up the Chinese mind from its long slumber and gave it the strongest possible stimulus to bloom forth as the Sung philosophy. While the Huayan school represented the intellectuality, so to speak, of the Chinese Buddhists, there was another school rising to power along with it and taking a stronger hold of their minds, which was Zen, or in Chinese, Chan. Zen appealed partly to the empirical proclivity of Chinese mentality and partly to its craving for mysticism. Zen despised learning of letters and upheld the intuitive mode of understanding, for its followers were convinced that this was the most direct and effective instrument with which to grasp ultimate reality. In fact, empiricism and mysticism and positivism can walk hand in hand quite readily. They all look for the facts of experience and are shy of building up an intellectual framework around them. But as social beings, people cannot remain content with mere experience. They want to communicate it to their fellow beings, which means that intuition is to have its contents, its ideas, its intellectual reconstruction. Zen did its best to remain on its intuitive plane of understanding, and made the best use of imagery, symbols, and poetic tricks, not a very dignified term. When, however, it had to have recourse to intellection, it was a good friend of the Huayan philosophy. The amalgamation of Zen and Huayan philosophy, though by no means deliberately carried out, became most noticeable with Cheng Huang and Song Mi in the 8th and 9th centuries, both of whom were great scholars of the Huayan school and at the same time followers of Zen. It was through this approach that Zen came to influence the Confucian thought of the Song scholars. The Tang dynasty thus prepared the way for the rise of the Song science of the Tao Sui, which I consider to be the most precious native product from the Chinese mental crucible, into which Huayan, Zen, Confucianism, and Taoism were thrown together. Chu Si had his predecessors, Chu Tun-yi, Zhang Hengchu, and the Cheng brothers, Ming Dao and Yi Chuan. They all tried to establish philosophy on a purely Chinese basis, as they found it chiefly in the 4 books, the Lunyu, the Mengzi, the Ta Sui, and the Chongyun, and also in the I Ching. That they all studied Zen and were indebted to it in the formulation of their doctrine is seen from the fact that they place so much significance on the experience of a sudden illumination that will come to them when they have duly applied themselves to the study of the classics or meditated on their meaning. In their cosmology or ontology, they set up as primordial substance Wu Qi or Tai Chi or Tai Su, which has a Buddhist ring. Translated in terms of ethics, this principle is sincerity or Cheng, and the ideal of life consists in cultivating the virtue of sincerity. For it is by this that the world is what it is. It is by this that the male principle and the female principle originating in the great limit interact and enable the orderly growth of all things. Sincerity is also called Li, reason, or Tian Li, heavenly reason. The Song philosophers have Qi opposed to Li, and this antithesis is unified in Tai Chi, which is Wu Qi. Li is the reason running through all things, impartially possessed by every one of them. Without Li, nothing is possible. Existences lose their being and are reduced to non-entity. Qi is a differentiating agency, whereby one reason multiplies itself and produces a world of pluralities. Li and Qi are thus interpenetrating and complementary. The relation of Tai Chi to Li and Qi is not very clear, except that it is the synthesis of the 2 principles. The Song philosophy did not apparently wish to remain dualistic, which is probably due to the influence of the Huayan school of Buddhism. As to Tai Chi itself, it is an ambiguous idea. It appears to be primordial matter, which is Wu Qi, the limitless. The one is something above matter, and the other is something below matter. And how can that which is above become that which is below, and vice versa? The same dilemma may be encountered in the case of Li and Qi, but in this respect the Song philosophers were decidedly Chinese, and had no inclination to follow the Buddhists, who did not hesitate to deny the materiality of the world and declare it and all things in it to be equally empty, or shunya. The Chinese mind always upheld a world of particular realities. Even when it closely approaches the Huayan, it stops short at materiality.